even before I started modeling, I always loved Burberry, and they were always one of my favorite lines, just because, I don't know, like, the clothes this season are so beautiful, and they're just so different from anything else that I've seen so far, and they just make you feel really good wearing them, so I love it. It's my second season, but last season I didn't go to Milan, so it's my first time here, but I actually love it. So a lot of people have told me that it's like kind of industrial and not as beautiful as Paris and everything, but I actually really like it. It's just a crazy change because a year ago I was just in school doing the normal high school thing, you know, and now it's all of this. So it's crazy, but it's good. I love it. One thing about the shows is like you get that rush, you know, and also you get to see all these people and meet so many new people, which you also get to do whenever you're doing editorials, but it's kind of different. But here you get to see your friends every day, so that's fun. I'm 17, so I kind of live in jeans most of the time, but for like some kind of formal event, absolutely, it would be like my dream to wear it, because it's, I don't know, just whenever you wear his clothes, the way that they're cut and the way that they're made, you know, it just makes you feel so, I don't know, just like if you're wearing it, then you know that you're gonna look good. It's always been like one of my dream shows to do, because so many shows it's just like, you know, the hair and makeup is uniform for everybody, and everybody just walks down the runway with a straight face, walks back on the runway, but this is just like so completely different, because it's more like acting than modeling, you know, and it's just, I think that he's so creative, and he just like dreams this whole world up with the collection that he designs, and I don't know, I think that it's really, really amazing that he's able to do this and that we're able to all be a part of it. Thank you.
Okay, so in the first video I talked about an urban legend having to do with fractional reserve banking, and talked about this whole issue of printing money out of thin air. Well, the urban legends are legion and lengthy, and there are a lot of them. So another urban legend associated with this that needs to be addressed is this question of you hear it in a lot of different contexts, but generally the argument is that because of the fact that this is so-called debt money, that it's being created out of thin air, and because there's interest being charged on principal, that it means that the Federal Reserve in this example, in this case, in the current case, has to keep creating money in order to provide the currency to repay the interest. So, in other words, when banks make loans and this currency is created, there's an interest obligation associated with it. But if this is how currency is being created and put into circulation through the paying of principal, then obviously that's not sufficient to provide the interest to repay those loans. In other words, the currency to repay the interest is not in circulation. It's never put into circulation at that point. So the argument goes, well, this means that then the Federal Reserve or whatever the central bank is, it has to perpetually keep printing more and more money, and that this is a fatal condition, that eventually the interest overwhelms everything else, and there's not enough interest money in circulation to pay all the debts, and all of the loans are called. But this is another, it's another urban legend that's a part of the larger urban legend surrounding all of this. So, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this theory generally? Because there are variations on this. There's one I saw that's called the mathematically perfected economy, and it's pretty clever because this one comes closer to any that I've seen as far as actually understanding the difference between currency and wealth. Which all roads seem to go back to that. It seems like such a simple concept, but then when you look at what people are saying, it's evident that either they don't or they're ignoring it or something. Because if they just simply applied that understanding, they wouldn't fall into these fallacies and urban legends. They wouldn't create these urban legends. So, what's wrong with this theory? Well, the problem with it is that, as we were saying in the first video, this currency creation de novo is a creation on the basis of the fact that new wealth was generated. So this means that in any economy that's growing, new wealth is going to be generated. And it's easy enough to do the calculations. This guy that came up with this mathematically perfected economy or economics, he even wrote software to represent this. And he seems to have, what seems to have happened, I could tell when I saw the software running that his assumptions were wrong, that something was wrong. Because what he was doing apparently was he was creating a function to represent the interest obligation growth, the rate at which the interest obligation grows, in order to see how long it would take before an economy would collapse. But the problem with that assumption is that, and let's call that function that he comes up with, let's call it f, and let's just assume that the function is correct, first of all. So he has a function that tells him over time, as a function of time, what the interest obligation in currency is going to be at some future date. Well, that's great. But he seems to I don't know if he's really, there's another function involved. We'll call it g. And he seems to be treating this function as if it's constant or linear or something, but the assumption is clearly invalid. And here's why. The function g is a function that tells us the rate at which new wealth is being created. Because if you recall, when you create currency de novo, one of the reasons for doing that is that the currency in circulation has to match the aggregate wealth. But if the aggregate wealth is increasing over time, you can't just look at the interest, you have to also look at how the wealth is changing. And so what it really comes down to is a competition between these two functions. In order to answer this question as to whether or not the economy is going to collapse, and in fact, this gets to capital accumulation and the Triffin dilemma, actually. You have to get to, and I haven't really written, I don't think Carr or I have written really about this explicitly because it does make, it makes the discussion more complicated, but since this has been brought up as an urban legend, we have to address it now. So basically, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to see, which function wins out, which one increases faster. Because if the wealth is increasing faster than the interest obligation, then so what? In other words, yes, they will have to continue to print more money, but so what? The economy requires it. Let me give you an example. If I borrow, to keep it simple, I'll borrow, and I'll put that in quotes, but I borrow $1. And let's say that the interest obligation is such that by the time I repay it, I will have repaid a total of $3. So I've paid 3 times the principal. So maybe it's a long-term loan, for example. And that is typical. That's not unusual. But suppose in that same time period that the aggregate wealth generated as a result of that loan, directly attributable to that new wealth, the initial new wealth creation, it appreciates, it grows. And what if it? I mean, just imagine, for the sake of discussion, that in that same time period it increases, say, to something like 10. So I'm paying back $3, but there's $7 of new wealth creation. So you're still going to have to print $7 more in addition to the interest. So no, the interest is in circulation. That's not an issue. It's only by ignoring the G function that you can come up with this fallacious argument. And the G function is interesting because it's really inscrutable. There is no way to know that. But if you talk to anyone in the business, who's in business and who's familiar with this, they'll tell you, that in all likelihood, when you average it out over all the kinds of different loans that are done across the country, the rate at which the wealth is growing probably is significantly higher than the interest. There are a lot of reasons to think that. The problem, though, is in how to characterize it precisely as a function. That's probably inscrutable. However, the rate at which G increases probably is higher than F, and historically has been. If it hadn't, the economy probably would have already collapsed, 100 years ago. So that's why that's fallacious. But this also brings us to a more fundamental level, too, that we haven't gone into yet, which is trying to better understand what wealth is. Because in order to answer that question, to even approach that question and ask, is an economy going to collapse because of this interest obligation? Well, we have to know something about G, and even to just estimate or guess, it might help us to know a little bit more about it. But in order to do that, we have to get even more fundamental. We have to start looking at what wealth really means. And we know what it means, in terms of a given instantaneous moment in time. The way we value wealth is simply subjectively by comparing it to other pieces of wealth in the economy. So you have a maxima and a minima. You have the least valuable thing in society and the most valuable thing in society that people can at least approximately assess and compare. And you got everything in between. And that's how we scale wealth. That's how we know what wealth is. And it is subjective, but that's how we value wealth in terms of a direct barter. If you had two pieces of wealth, how would you know which one's more valuable, or how do people do that assessment? Well, they're doing it based on this perspective, this relative comparison within the body or the aggregate collection of wealth itself. That's how they do it. But it gets more difficult when you try to do it over time. If you're trying to measure or compare two pieces of wealth, whatever they may be, in two completely different time periods. And that becomes relevant in this question, because what's really being asked is maybe 30 years later, has G increased faster than the interest obligation function F? And to answer that, then you do have to understand something about how wealth changes over time. And the key to that is to find the most common denominator as far as a way to represent value and wealth. Is there something about wealth that is common, maybe not ubiquitous, but is common enough that if we were to define it on that basis, we could value everything else relative to it? So is there some attribute of wealth that we could examine on a more fundamental level? And the answer is yes. The answer is that wealth really, if you want a really general definition that you could use, you could do it this way. You could say that wealth is basically joules energy per second's time, which is called power in physics, or watts. It's the wattage. What do we mean by that? Well, it takes a certain amount of wattage to produce a given piece of wealth in a given time t. And that's what that's saying. All wealth can't be characterized that way, obviously, but the fact that so much of it can, the fact that such a large proportion of it can be, that you could use that as a metric to compare the rest of the wealth to that. So like a Vincent van Gogh painting, that calculation wouldn't work. But if you do know, for example, the total wattage required to produce an automobile, then you could compare that to people could use that as a measuring stick to decide how much they think a Van Gogh painting is worth. A good example of what I'm talking about and how technology changes, because that's really the key here. It's technological innovation and change. That's what's going to really affect G nowadays. That wasn't the case 200 years ago, but that is now the dominant portion of the G function. And here's why. Let's take the example of a shovel and a backhoe. Technologically speaking, a shovel is simpler and a backhoe is more complex, but they can be used to do the same job. As long as we restrict our definition, and so we'll have to extend the physics definition of power and work done. It's called work done. We'll have to extend that definition a little bit. But the rate at which you can dispense energy into the environment is power. The work done is the amount of energy or potential energy represented in the result of that. So, but that has a specific definition in physics. We need a broader definition. So what we would need economically is we'd need to say that given certain parameters, certain quality controls, certain constraints and parameters or tolerances, how much work can we do within a given time t with a given technology? And when you look at it that way, you can see the shovel is almost directly proportional to the power that a human being could supply. And you would have to standardize that. You'd have to say, whatever the average human metabolic energy is and so on. But with a backhoe, it becomes mechanical. It becomes much more technologically involved. And the amount of power available vastly exceeds what is available with just a shovel and a person, a man or a woman, operating the shovel. So when you do it that way, what you see is that now wealth, the maximum and the minimum of wealth, is actually technologically bound, that it has a technologically bound definition. Because if you take the simplest technology in existence, compare it to the most sophisticated technology in existence for that same role or task, then you have a metric, you have a comparison you can do. And you can say, and you can do it in wattage. So you can measure it in watts, which is, joules energy per second's time is all you're talking about. Now, again, you can't represent everything that way. But if you can represent a sufficient proportion of the wealth that way, you do have a metric. So now we can compare technologies or wealth in different time periods using this method. And this is just all hypothetical. I'm not even suggesting anybody do this. I'm just saying, theoretically, in principle, at some point, this is possible. And you could say, okay, then let me compare the backhoe of the year 2000 to whatever the ditch digging tool is 100 years from now, or 30 years from now, and then compare the wattage. Now we have a way to compare wealth in different time periods, and it's fairly objective and it's fairly algorithmic. So what I'm saying here is that the G function, apart from the theoretical discussion, I'm just saying all of this to kind of expound and illuminate on this a little bit and show how big of a factor technology has become. Because the G function nowadays, at this point in time, is now being dominated by technology. Because these numbers, these differences you see in wattage are dramatic. They're huge. So the amount of energy or power at the disposal of human beings per capita is increasing rapidly. And this has an intimate connection to the meaning of wealth. So if you want to understand whether or not the interest obligation is going to kill an economy, you have to figure out first which function is going to beat out which. So you can't really conclude anything from that. It could be right, but we don't really have any way of knowing. If you look at the world today, and you just look at what's going on, you can look around and you can say, well, yeah, it looks like that the interest obligation seems to be getting out of control because globalization is just one indication, because this is just the flip side again of capital accumulation, and we've talked about before. But capital accumulation means that in a capitalist system over time, the wealth tends to accrete into the hands of a smaller and smaller minority. And what that means is that eventually all of the wealth is sucked out of the hands of everyone else and put into the hands of a minority, and that's fatal because it kills the economy. Because obviously a worker who's contributing to that economy, who's maybe poor, has to eat, they have to have a place to live and all that stuff to be productive. So if you take all of the wealth away from them, then they will die. So obviously that can't happen. That would be a fatal condition. And that's really what they're getting at with this argument. That's really what they're saying. They're talking about the acceleration of capital accumulation. The Triffid dilemma is the same thing on a global scale. So it's the accretion of wealth in one jurisdiction as a result of certain advantages, well, as a result of capitalism, but advantages stacked on top of that. In particular, in the case of the United States, it would be the fact that you are the holder of the reserve currency. But that's another video, another discussion. The point I'm trying to make here is that the basic argument is that because of this interest obligation, because of the fact that more and more currency has to be circulated in order to pay it, it means that the economy will fail. That's not necessarily true. It depends on the relationship between F and G. So going back again to just kind of overviewing the first video as kind of a preface to this one, and looking at this a little bit more fundamentally. And I don't mean to, I know this is a rather simple thing to do, but it's so evident that there's a disconnect between this notion of currency and wealth that it might be helpful for some anyway to use an explicit example. So I'm going to put up an image here of four different bars you can see, and I'm going to show you what's really going on here. Because if you understand these relationships, everything else falls out. And the conclusion from the first video is just reinforced here. Because if you take number one, the first bar, what that drawing represents in this illustration is the total aggregate wealth of an economy, of a nation, of any defined unit. We'll just call it a country to keep it simple. That bar is the magnitude of the wealth. So you can think of it kind of like a gold bar. It's just a bar. The longer that bar is, the more the wealth there is. The shorter it is, the less wealth. And that's what the bar represents. Its length is what tells you how much wealth is there. And so in this example, to explain what's going on in this relationship between currency and wealth, which apparently still isn't clear, we could take that bar and keep its length constant. Let's assume the wealth doesn't change, just for the sake of the discussion so far. And then we can start putting metrics on it. We can start putting tick marks on it, like you see in 2, 3, and 4, that show what the units are that we're using to represent that wealth. So, for example, one tick mark could be the equivalent of, say, something like $1. So, for each of these tick marks, we could emit a currency in circulation in an amount that equals the number of these tick marks, and then that would represent the wealth in existence. And that's what number 2 is, or actually number 4. 4 would be the status quo, the initial condition, where you printed currency to represent the total wealth. And you see there that there's $6 with some change in between. Looks like $6. It's 6 units, right? But what the currency wealth relationship is telling you is that if we pull $2 out of circulation, and we can call that $6 or 6 billion, it doesn't matter. The point is still the same. If we pull $2 out of that $6 circulation, we'll end up with $4, which is what you see in drawing 2. And that's what sort of graphically makes it clear what we're talking about. Because if you look at each of the tick marks, now $1 represents a bigger slice or bigger chunk of that bar, that wealth bar. And that means now that each dollar is worth more, because $1 now represents more wealth. And that's when we took $2 out of circulation. We reduced M1. We reduced the money in circulation. That's called deflation. And it causes the dollar to become more valuable. And this is what they're talking about with scarcity. They use these terms that really just confuse, that really don't tell you anything. The currency in the example of 2 is more scarce than it is in 4, but that really doesn't explain much. What they're really saying is that each dollar is going to represent a bigger chunk of the overall amount of wealth out there. Conversely, we could take that $6 and we could add, what looks like six and a half more dollars into. We could put $6.5 more into circulation, and then we'd get that 12.5. And you see there in 3, $12.5 representing all of that same wealth that didn't change. And then you have inflation. That's inflation because now each dollar, as you can see, as a slice of that bar, represents less of the bar. The dollar represents less wealth, so it's less valuable. That's how you devalue a dollar. It's about putting too much in circulation. And this is what we mean by currency chasing wealth. The idea here is to keep that balance, to keep it at 6. So that if the bar would increase, and let's go down to look at image 4. If that bar were to increase by what is in 4, just 4, 1 unit, $1, then we would expect that you would need to print another dollar and put it in circulation. You'd need $7 in circulation to represent that wealth. That's what you're trying to do, and that's a healthy economy. And this is why all of this talk about printing money out of thin air is baloney, because but here's the problem, though. The problem is in the terminology. Banks calling these loans is what's really confusing people, I think. Because if you remember, we said that the Fed flips a switch and currency is created in a bank account, right? But that currency creation is representative of new wealth that's been created. And that was in the Home Depot example. So that money that was, quote, loaned was used to build a Home Depot. And you might say, well, yeah, but if I buy an old house, that's not really new wealth. Well, it is, but what you're doing is you're asking, what is the new wealth generated when the house was built, not at the time the loan was made. And it is that minus the depreciation, because someone else has been using it. That just kind of makes the math more complicated, but you'll get the same answer. So it's easier to visualize if you just think of it as new wealth, but it still comes out the same way. That currency being created represents new wealth. It always does. And here's the key. Here's what you would have to ask to know whether or not a claim like this is valid or not. If someone says currency is being created out of thin air, all you need to know is okay, is there what, when, where, and how of the money creation? How'd that happen? You just know what that's all about, and then how much, when, all that, and then you would ask, is there some explicit legal connection between this print run, this currency production, and some new wealth somewhere that we can identify? And the answer is always yes, because there's a promissory note. The promissory note is the legal instrument that definitively ties an identifiable piece of collateral of new wealth to that currency. It's a paper trail. So it's well established. The currency being created in these accounts is being created de novo, out of new, because the wealth was created de novo. If you go back to the bar again, and all this just goes back to this illustration. All you need is this illustration to understand this. If the bar gets longer, what you have when the Fed deposits this money de novo in an account is the bar got longer. There's a legally valid paper trail from that new wealth creation to that currency print. And that's what justifies the print. And of course it's legitimate, because you have to match currency to wealth. It's not an issue of a loan. It's an issue of the fact that the wealth of the country changed, and as a service to the public, you have to have enough currency in circulation to represent it. It's just a service to the public. It's not a loan. And this is where people get confused. A loan would be if you took wealth from that bar, a slice of that wealth, and you gave it to someone else in that same country, and you said, pay me back for it later. But in that example, you didn't add any wealth to the bar. You didn't actually slice it out. You just identified a slice in that bar, and you said, I'll give you ownership of it, and then you can pay me back for it. But notice that no wealth ever entered or left the system. It's the same wealth. That would be a loan. What the banks are doing is not a loan, and this is the problem, or part of it. They're misleading the public by using this kind of terminology. This is not a loan. In general federalism, they call it a considerable bond, or either just a compensation for financial productivity. But basically, this is not a loan. And that's what we meant when we said that the currency print equitably would be distributed to all the people who created that new wealth. And when I said that, I didn't mean just the line workers. I'm not just talking about the laborers, the hands-on laborers. It's anyone in that organization that was responsible for creating that new wealth. The CEO, the managers, the workers, everybody. It's equitable. It's proportionate. It's paid. It would be distributed according to their pay scale and their time committed, and so on and so forth. So when you see it this way, when you understand what the relationship between currency and wealth really is, you can clearly see it's not a loan. It's really simple. And what the bank is doing is they're requiring repayment of principal and interest, which is in fact a repayment of that print run back to the bank. But the bank and the Fed and the president and Elvis Presley and whoever else had nothing to do with the creation of the new wealth. The actual legally valid paper trail back to the new wealth de facto traces that wealth or that currency, that de novo currency, back to the wealth generator. It belongs to the wealth generator. Law and equity, rule of law, would require that. And the reason why I think partly why this is so confusing and deceptive to people and has been so deceptive is the fact that we don't normally think of an economy in those terms. We don't normally think about the world that way. It's seldom discussed, this issue of wealth and currency, so no one ever really thinks about it. But the fact is the very existence of currency is a public service. It has nothing to do with loans. It has to do with the fact that society is trying to, they've created a mechanism called currency to allow them to trade in wealth. It's simply a tool. That's all it is. It's a metric. So you might say, well, then, okay, what about the person that actually made the, quote, loan in this example? What would be a loan in the traditional example? What about that person? What's their relationship? Well, that also takes us to a deeper level, because now we have to ask, okay, if all of this new wealth was generated by the people that created the Home Depot, built the Home Depot, then what role does the person who owns the Home Depot have? What are they doing there? Why are they in the loop? Well, they don't have to be, but generally there would be someone there in the loop. And the connection requires a little bit more expounding on all of this to explain. But basically, we've kind of whitewashed a little detail here to make things simpler. There's a detail we've left out, and that is that all new wealth consists of all of this labor I'm talking about that is, in the right word for it probably is inhered. Marx used a term called congealed labor, but it's actually a different concept, so I don't want to confuse the two. The labor inhered in the wealth is really what we've been talking about. There's new wealth created, and it took a certain amount of wealth to produce it. So that's the inhered labor. That's where the new currency legally should go. That's who should own it. That would be the owner. But in the real world, what we're doing is, in the traditional world, existing world, what we're doing is we're paying those workers in currency from that print run as a kind of release of ownership. They're releasing their ownership of it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the new wealth created isn't just derived of that labor. There's a slice we haven't discussed, and that's the natural resources that went into it. So when you build a Home Depot, there's a production chain, a capital production chain, where you have, like, for example, the lumber being used. That was cut and dried and chemically treated and so on somewhere else by other workers. But this de novo monetary creation equitably would go to them as well. It would all be equitable. It would be distributed to all of the people had anything to do with the creation of that new wealth. And that's what fiducial economics and general federalism deals with. It deals with what the math is. How do you equitably distribute this kind of wealth? That's what it's talking. I mean, that's the meat and potatoes of it. But anyway, the natural resources, however, begin at the beginning of that production chain. It's whatever you pulled out of the ground. It's plants, it's animals. It's something you're getting from nature, raw. And the natural resources are a part of that wealth. So when someone goes and says, I want a print run, or I'd like to have an increase in currency so that I can go build a Home Depot, what are they really saying? They're not loaning money. What they're doing is they're proposing that new wealth be created. But the truth of the matter is, what you find is that when you look at the natural resources, and this is also a part of fiducial economics, I'm not going to tangent on here, but you can read about it. There's videos on it if you want to learn about how this works, or how we know this. But if you apply equity to this problem of natural resources, the only equitable answer is that with division of labor, the community writ large must share in the ownership of all of the natural resources. It can't be owned by one person or some minority of people, not if it's done equitably. Of course, historically, this has created problems because as soon as you start talking about ownership, private property, which is where this is going, and we ask, what's the role of the quote loaner? The problem historically with this has been is that that's been abused. That if you start talking about, well, the person doesn't really own it, that the government owns it, or that someone else owns it, it starts causing problems. So the way this was solved in fiducial economics was this idea of a public trust was created. And again, this is too long to get into here, but basically, the person who's going to make the loan in a equitable, just economy would not be taking out a loan, but the person fulfilling that role, that person would not be the owner of that Home Depot. And there is a distinction here we're going to get to in a second between private property and commercial property. We're talking about commercial property right now. But in the case of commercial property, they would not be the owner of that Home Depot. The Home Depot would be titled in a public trust. But the way you saw it in the public trust is simply a trust fund. It's a legal entity. It's not the government. It's not any person. It's just a legal entity. But the way you protect people from what we've seen happen before when you do stuff like this is that the person that's actually doing this becomes a fiduciary of the public trust. And a fiduciary is someone, and this is a trick that wealthy people, rich people have used for a long time to protect their money because it works so well. It keeps people from abusing and taking advantage of it. What it does is just like when you loan money for a house or a car, you don't really own it. The bank owns it because they have the deed. But for all practical intents and purposes, you do own it because you can do whatever you want with it, for the most part. A fiduciary is the same way. A fiduciary who owns or who is the fiduciary over a Home Depot would not literally be the owner, but they would de facto effectively be the owner. They could do whatever they wanted with it. They're a fiduciary. And as long as they stayed within certain broad ethical boundaries, that they would be fine. They could do whatever they wanted. That's how fiducial economics solves that problem. Because see, and this is why I've defended bankers before. Because this to fix this problem is much bigger than just let's get rid of the Fed. It's a complete redo of the entire system. It has to be if it's going to be equitable and it's going to be done right and it's going to be done in a durable way that picks up the lessons of history. Because you have to change the legal system. You have to change how all this works. So when someone goes and wants to make a profit and build a for-profit business, the public owns that property, but they're a fiduciary. And they can profit from it in the same way that a CEO does. It's not any different. But the proceeds are equitably distributed throughout the organization. So just going back to the point that I was making, it's not a loan in any sense of the word at all. And so someone has to own it. And this is why ultimately someone has to own it. Someone has to ultimately have the legal title to it. And this is part of the reason why the system works the way it does. Because without calling it a loan, how do you ascribe ownership when it's paid off or whenever this account is settled? How do you resolve ownership? Because nobody wants to have a socialist system. Nobody wants to say, oh, well, it's just deeded over to the government. No one wants to do that for good reason. So loaning helps us actually, in a roundabout way, it helps us identify a legal owner. It helps us identify who's going to actually own it. The way you solve that in fiducial economics and general federalism is you say, well, you know what? No, that can't really, equitably, that can't be the case because the natural resources that make up that wealth, in some cases, we'll cover the other cases later, but in some cases, in most cases, the natural resources that make up that wealth, they are publicly owned. The only equitable way to do that, and that's a whole other video, but the only equitable way to do that is to say that they're publicly owned. Everyone owns them equally, and it's because of division of labor and the fact that in order for everyone to be treated fairly and equitably, they have to have some say over the way people use resources that their lives depend on. That's where equity comes in, and that's why it has to be publicly owned. But that doesn't mean it has to be socialist. All it means is that there needs to be some means of accountability, and that's exactly what fiduciaries are best for. That's what you do. You bring fiduciaries into the picture. So the natural resources are owned publicly. So the Home Depot is owned publicly. But obviously, to disentangle the inhered labor from the Home Depot, you have to have some way of doing that. You have to have some way of getting that out of the public trust and paying these people in actual currency, and that's what the currency is for. The currency does that. So going back to the original point of the first video was, look, the de novo money creation is done because of a de novo wealth creation. And all you have to do is just ask a few questions about that to figure out whether or not that connection exists. As long as there's a valid legal connection there, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing odd going on. The lie, the farce, the fraud that's going on has to do with this whole idea of loans and really misusing these terms. And the proceeds of these de novo money creations going to the wrong people. It makes absolutely no sense at all that the principal or interest is going to a banker. The banker had nothing to do with the creation of the new wealth. In fact, they don't provide any service at all, because the service they're providing is a fraud. So there really is no service there for which they're due compensation. They don't even need to exist. The public trust would obviously have to have some kind of dispersing mechanism that is a lot like a bank, but really for creating currency and for dealing with all this stuff. But that's all you really need, and it really doesn't even have to be a traditional bank. So anyway, that's the problem. And this other urban legend about economies collapsing because of interest payment, well, it may or may not be true. There's no way to know because G is inscrutable. But in all likelihood, it's going to be a heck of a contest because technology is changing rapidly. And G is mostly composed of technological change. It's almost like a composition function where G is composed of H, and H is the technology function. And H is sort of becoming, over time, is dominating the G function more and more and more. So that's the other urban legend. And the point that's being missed here, as I said in the other video, is that the compensation rates in this country right now are about a tenth what they should be. In a fiducial economic system, they'd be 10 times. All else being equal, they'd be about 10 times larger than what they are now. That addresses the urban legend. The other thing, though, since we've brought this up and opened up this can of worms, is this issue of private property and ownership. So I was talking about commercial property, but in the case of private property, anything that involves a transfer of wealth that's already exists within the economy doesn't require all of this. There's no need for that then to be owned publicly. So there's still private property. People still exchange property. It's just that when you go to start a business, that's what becomes a part of the public trust. That new wealth generated is the public trust. Once it's sold on the market at valuable consideration for private consumption, it reverts to private property. It's the way it works. It's the way the math works out. And it's all driven by formulas that are in the Constitution and in that paper, An Introduction to General Federalism, which you should read. There's also a video series on that. But anyway, that's my answer to that. So there's the second urban legend out there about Federal Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, and fractional reserve banking. It's not true, and it distracts from the bigger issue. The bigger issue is that there's a massive theft going on, and the only way to fix that is to completely redo the entire system. The entire system is antiquated. People have all sorts of half measures about how to solve it, and it's not going to work. Not justly, not durably, because of the reasons we just talked about. There has to be a way legally to frame this that's valid, legitimate. One thing I haven't mentioned, though, is there is this thing of depreciation too. And that's handled through bond settlements, what are called bond settlements. But basically, if you if you went to a bank and you wanted to, not a bank, but under fiducial economics, if you needed to buy something for private use, it's supposed to be private property, but it's too expensive to buy with a paycheck. Things like houses and cars. Loans are not entirely actually. Loans under fiducial economics don't exist. This still is a print run, and it's not a loan. But you can apply for that based on certain criteria. If it's something that is, necessary or needed for, personal or private something productively private, such as I need a car to go to work. If it can be justified, then yes, you can get a print run for that. But what you have to do is you have to do a bond settlement set by the house of the fiduciary. It'd probably be every year, but every year, for example, you would have a bond settlement where the depreciation of that thing would be calculated, and you would have to pay for that depreciation. It's almost like a tax, but what it's really doing is it's controlling the currency in circulation. So it's keeping the currency matched to the wealth. Because if you didn't do that, that currency that was released for the purchase of the new car would remain in circulation, even though the car depreciated, even though the overall wealth fell. So that's what that's for. So it's not, like everything for nothing. You still have to pay for certain. You have to pay for everything that you don't, that you pay for out of pocket. You'd have to pay for, and anything that you can't pay out of pocket, big items, you'd have to also pay for, and you'd have to pay for that by paying off the depreciation. So anyway, that's it for now. I'll probably hit another urban legend again here in a little bit, and we'll be back in a little bit.